We found we had to go to 2 services to accommodate us all, and a lot of that has to do with so many children.
We were starting our capital campaign to purchase our first home because we'd been renting, and our minister announced that he was leaving.
We're in the process of getting an interim minister. We're looking to an exciting process of revisioning our future now, and the promise of the future couldn't be any greater for us right now.
We called last year a new settled minister who is a good match for us, and the energy level in our congregation, there is nothing that we can't do now.
You've just heard congregational leaders talk about the change that's occurring in their congregation. You may have heard at one time the expression change at the speed of church. The implication being that change in congregations occurs at a slower pace than the rest of the world. I'm not certain that's true anymore. We're here at UU University, along with 450 others, listening to Gil Rendle, senior consultant with the Alban Institute, talk about how leaders can help manage change that's occurring in congregations in a way that is vital, healthy, and mission-based, as opposed to the alternate. Join me, if you would, in listening to Gil Rendle talk about leading change in our congregations.
Leadership is one of the most difficult tasks that I can imagine, but one of the most interesting. You'll hear as we go along today and this evening, I am fully convinced that we are in one of the most difficult times of leadership, in which leadership calls us to be appropriately messy because of what we have to do. It is one of the hardest tasks we have ever been given. Can you imagine anything better than that? This is wonderful. There's not a boring thing that we can do as leaders anymore. We are now in a time of leadership. I am now in a time of leadership for which I was not trained, for which I was not prepared. I was given a lot of leadership tools, but they were leadership tools for an earlier day and for a different situation. You and I have been trained to automatically seek solutions. Now, the dilemma to that is sometimes we don't even know what the problem is, but we have been trained to seek solutions. We almost have a genetic need to fix things, and we look for things that are broken. This is the kind of leadership background that we come from. And it's not because there's something wrong with it, it's just because that's who we are, that's who we've been as a culture, and it is a form of leadership that works. And it was the primary way in which we exercised our leadership, particularly in past decades. How do we help leaders understand that old ways of looking at everything as if it's a problem doesn't always work anymore? I spend a lot of time working with groups trying to understand the fact that much of what we are facing today as leaders in congregations may be uncomfortable and we may not choose it, but friends, they are not problems. And one of the reasons that they're not problems is because they have no solutions. I was invited to work with a congregation a few years back, and what they wanted to talk about was why they were growing at 4%, and their surrounding community was growing at 7%. Now, do you hear the question? They've already kind of sat down, looked at the information. They've already measured growth, both in the church and both in the community, and they've measured the difference, and they're asking a pretty informed question. Why is there a difference between our growth and the community growth? And so we began at that point in the conversation. We had the charts and the graphs. We put them up. We looked at the rate of growth of all these different, these 2 different parts. And pretty soon I realized that they were talking about the fact that they were not growing. They simply described themselves as not growing. And so I stopped the conversation. And I said, friends, this doesn't make sense to me. You are now talking about the fact that you're not growing, and you were talking. You even invited me here to talk about why your growth rate of change is different from the community. You are growing. To which the leader of the committee looked at me and says, well, Gil, yeah, you're right. Yeah, we are growing, but they're not good members. Now, friends, what you need to know is that as soon as a consultant gets you in that spot, he has you exactly where he wants you. And so I said to them, that's great. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to get into small groups, and I would like you to describe a good member. What did they describe? Themselves. Absolutely. A good member here is someone who shows up at worship every single Sunday, who serves on the board, who sings in the choir, who makes potato salad and does all the telephone calls. Just like they do. These were people who were receiving members in a community that was going through a lot of development, a lot of housing development. They were young families. They were moving in. They had parents that were two-income. They were giving birth to children that genetically had to go to a soccer camp by the time they were 3 years old. These were busy people. And if you think about that, they were trying to do ministry with a people in which they wanted a relationship with the people which is different from the relationship that the people wanted with the church. And so what do? We say that's a problem. We call them bad members, and we try to fix them. So we're at a time in which some of those old problem formats in our minds don't work anymore. A favorite story of mine comes from working with an Episcopal congregation out of Memphis, and the priest was trying to work with his leaders, and they were talking about children's formation. And they were stuck on the problem of how difficult it is to have a religious education program for children when the children don't show up every week. Have you noticed that? And you have this graded curriculum that is built on, this week's lesson is going to build into next week's lesson, except the kids don't keep coming back. And worse than that, some of the teachers don't either. It's hard to get the teachers to be there all the time, right? The priest was working with his group to say, part of what is going on here is we have to learn how to stop doing ministry with pew renters. And we have to start learning how to do ministry with timeshare people. And timeshare people are the people who are going to be there at certain times when they can, given the rest of the mix that is part of their lives. But it does not mean that it is any less important to them. That they are deeply committed to a life of faith. But they need a different relationship. These are not problems. This is the challenge of leadership, learning how to look at a situation that may not be up to our expectations, but one which is sufficiently different that we have to actually learn something new in order to be in ministry with these people. And friends, trying to fix people to make them like us is not necessarily a good strategy.
Part 2 of this opening chapter tackles a subject we youth think we know well: diversity.
The idea that we are more diverse these days is a very useful one. And he had some good ideas on how to attack that.
But what does diversity have to do with leadership? In particular, the need for new kinds of leadership? A lot more than you might imagine.
The world has changed around us. This is one of the key items for all of us. The context of our congregations have changed. This is why we really need to talk about you can't find new paths using old leadership. When I was in high school, my congregation worshiped at about 400 to 600 average attendance, depending upon what Sunday. And what made the difference was our music director, not our preacher. Now, that congregation was served by one full-time pastor. That was the total clergy program staff we had. Now, I don't know if that feels really different for you, but right now, kind of the rule of thumb that a lot of people will use with congregations is that most congregations, just to maintain status quo ministry, need the equivalent of one full-time program person for every 100 to 150 in worship. And so that means, according to today's standards, just to keep things on an even keel, the congregation I grew up in should have had anywhere from 3 to 5 full-time equivalent program or clergy people. We had one. And everybody remembers those times as being remarkably vital. And so how could that be? Well, one of the real reasons for that is because I was going to church back then in a time of convergence. That congregation was being fully supported by the values of the culture in the way that it behaved. Do you know that everybody who came into that church already agreed on what churches did before they even walked in the door? that there was such consensus in the community, such consensus in the culture about what congregations were all about, that everybody already agreed and they self-organized around what they were going to do because there was almost no disagreement about it. It's called a convergent environment. It's one that kind of rests on consensus. It's one in which the majority gets to say how it is, and everybody who doesn't agree with the majority behaves as if they did. That's not the world we live in today. Charles Handy talks about the fact from an organizational development perspective that we no longer live in a convergent environment, we live in a divergent environment. Now the difference here has a lot to do with a very simple kind of a rule. In a convergent environment, the question is the same for everybody and the answer is the same for everybody. A convergent question for us here gathered today in this room is, how far is it to the Portland airport? The question is the same for everybody. The answer is the same for everybody. When I was growing up, I was doing leadership, and I was part of a congregation that lived on leadership that was geared to a convergent environment. Does that make sense? We live in a divergent time, and a divergent time is one in which the question is the same for everybody, but the answer is different. A divergent question for us in the room here today would be, why do you want to go to the Portland airport? And there would be a lot of answers to that, especially to you who don't want to go. Today, we are doing ministry in a divergent culture, and the people who are coming into our congregations are divergent folk, all of who have different needs and different assumptions and different ideas about what ministry is all about, what faith formation is all about, and what congregations ought to do. Do you realize no matter how small you are, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're, below the 200 mark that you raise your hand for or above the 200 mark, that diversity lives within our culture. Now, the dilemma is that's not what we've been trained for. The dilemma is that we've been trained for the convergent time, and the primary way in which we have been trained is as a problem solver. You and I have come through a time in our culture in which the dominant mode in which people were trained to practice leadership was to be a problem solver. And so we were trained a very, very simple, straightforward process. What you do is you identify what the problem is. You identify then what are the options to address that problem. You make a decision based on those options, and then you move to action. It's really straightforward. It's very clear, and we're good at it. How many of you have ever done that in your life? This is what we've been taught leadership is all about. And another word for leadership is management, because it makes everything go smooth. Now, problem solving, the first thing we are trained to do is to frame something as a problem. What we were taught from the very beginning is that if you can frame it as a problem, you are already 2/3 of the way toward a solution because you've developed agreement about what you have to work on. And you and I are good at framing problems. And so you shape the problem and then you identify the options. Well, what can we do about this? The dilemma, though, is that fewer and fewer of our situations that we face in our congregations are problems, as I was saying, mostly because they have fewer and fewer solutions. The generations that are in your congregation is another example. When I was growing up, at best, there were 3 different generations in our congregations. Today, there's as many as 5 different generational cohorts. The length of life has simply made the mix of people significantly different. Now, what's really helpful there is to realize that every single generational cohort has a particular value system out of which it lives, and every single generational cohort develops its value system as a corrector to the excess that they saw in the value system that went before them. All right? Now, my parents were GIs. They came back from the Second World War. The GIs were a very organized people. Did you know that? They brought order to the whole world, and then they came back to the United States, and they ordered everything that they could find around them. And so for the first time, we had suburbs and housing developments. Before they left for the war, you could play sandlot baseball. After you came back, you had to play Little League, because everything was ordered, and it was a remarkable transition in our culture. Outstanding. And so my generation came along and said, thank you, that was well done. But my, you are very sterile people. There's no spontaneity to your life. You have no enjoyment. And so my generation set off for freedom. Does this make sense? My generation set off for freedom, to take all the boundaries away and to explore everything and to be spontaneous. To which our children came along and said, my, you must have had a good time. But we'd like to know who our family is. And every generational cohort comes along and it has values that are used to correct what they saw wrong with the generation that went before. That means that every single generational cohort speaks badly of the one that went before and the one that comes after. And you and I, now in our congregations, have at least 5 different generational value systems, all saying how it should be. There is no way, friends, that you who are in leadership can solve that as if it's a problem. How do you lead today when there are multiple answers to every single question that you can ask? How do you lead today when you begin to talk about vital worship, when in fact that has an answer that has so many different flavors to it? How do you have a stewardship program today when people think and talk about their money in such different ways? Do you know that if you were a GI, that your primary learning about money was that if you had any, you protected it? That because of the Second World War and because of the Depression, if you had assets today, you were very careful with them, and because you might not have them tomorrow. And so there were 2 rules. One is that if you have assets, you save it for a rainy day. And the second rule is it never rains. That's a lifelong lesson. And then they had children that grew up through an expanding economy that was marked by inflation. And think about how different the lessons are there. In those lessons, essentially what you get is the primary lesson that if you have money today, spend it because you're going to get more tomorrow. And if you have money today, spend it today because it's worth more today than it will be tomorrow. And so you who are in a congregation, you sit down and you talk about how we're going to deal with our money, and you're going to have some people say, well, what we need to do is we need to invest it, we need to protect it, we need not to touch it, while the other people are saying, no, you need to spend it. I was working with a congregation, and they knew that they need to develop a new facility. And they had been planning for this facility, and the question was, were they ready now to talk to the architect to have the first drawing? And some of the people were saying, no, you can't talk to the architect now. We only have 98% of the funds in hand. Okay, now these are not really tight people. These are people who just simply learned a life lesson. But at the same time, they're sitting down with another generation that actually has learned how to use debt as a money management tool. And so which of those is faithful stewardship? And the answer is yes. But what I want us to see is that from a leadership perspective, there's no solution to that. It simply has to be part of the conversation.